the way the White House is now using land swap appears to be Ukraine gives up land to Russia in return for Russia stopping attacking it, which isn't much of a swap, really. I mean, it's sort of saying, if you stop hitting me, I'll give you what you want, which I think is obviously a little bit difficult for the Ukrainian people to swallow, particularly if there's no real guarantee that the hitting is actually going to stop for the long term.
3 people have died in a Russian airstrike on the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia ahead of talks at the White House between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. The US president claims his Ukrainian counterpart could end the war almost immediately, although won't offer him NATO membership or the return of Crimea as part of any deal. Well, one of the key issues in the White House talks today is going to be the Donbass region. What Putin wants is for them to be handed over. Justin Crump is a military veteran and CEO of strategic advisory firm Sibylline and joins me now. Justin, hello.
Hello, Hugo.
Thank you for being with us. Can you give us a sense of the Donbass from a military standpoint? Who has what at the moment and what potential changes might be there?
Yes, when we talk about the Donbass, primarily we're talking about the 2 southeastern oblasts of Ukraine. So that's Luhansk, which is pretty much 100% in Russian hands now, and Donetsk, which is about 70% in Russian hands. And the area Ukraine still holds, and I should remind you and listeners, I mean, this is 11 years now into the conflict in Donbass itself, which precedes the whole-scale Russian invasion in 22. Ukraine holds the northern part of Donetsk, which has a pretty large urban area there with 3 major cities, pretty much a conurbation, roughly the size of Bristol and Bath combined in terms of population. And it's important really for Ukraine because not only morally, not only because of the population there, but also militarily, it's been for a long time the bastion that kind of protects the more open land further to the west in Zaporizhzhia and towards the river Dnipro. So it's also the hub for supplies to the region and for maintaining Ukraine's military effort in that region, which is why it's such a critical area and why Ukraine spent so much blood and time defending that particular area of terrain.
In other words, it's not just worth defending on its own account, although I'm sure it is. It makes it easier to defend the rest of Ukraine as well.
Yes, I think that's the key military aspect of it. The moral aspect is, of course, Ukraine shouldn't have to give up any land to an aggressor that's coming and taking it by force. There are always discussions with the Donbass, though it was the Soviet industrial heartland. Russia always talks about the great mineral wealth of the Donbass. I mean, at this point in world history, that's less important. I mean, coal deposits, for example, are not necessarily as vital as once they were. And really, that's become an excuse for, I think, what's really a nationalist move by Russia. But the entire campaign that Russia's been waging in Ukraine is based on Putin in 2014 promising liberation to the Donbass. And it's a goal that's eluded Russia for 11 years. So that's why Donetsk, or the remaining part of Donetsk, is so important. But we shouldn't forget the Russians are also in Zaporizhzhia, which is an oblast further west, and in Kherson. Now, they don't control all of those, but the Russians did stage a referendum, you may remember, in late 2022, where they formally annexed those regions as well. It's interesting, they're not on the table. I think the Russians offering to sort of freeze the front lines there. But in theory, under Russian law, they're on Russian maps as being part of Russia. They can't be left as Ukrainian occupied territory. So the focus on Donetsk is key and interesting because it's Putin's main effort and has been throughout the conflict. But I think Zaporizhzhia and Kherson very important as well, and seeing what's being said about those.
I mean, so when Donald Trump talks about, when he uses the word swap, saying there could be land swaps, obviously we can't know precisely what he means, but sort of in a best interpretation, basically what he means is what? It means Ukraine giving up land it's currently defending and Russia sort of giving up land it's currently invading.
Well, I mean, that's what you'd think the term land swap meant. And I think a little bit of that comes back from when Ukraine had Russian territory. If you remember, they pushed into Kursk last year. And then the idea was actually that Russia could have its land back in return for Ukraine having its land back. The way the White House is now using land swap appears to be Ukraine gives up land to Russia in return for Russia stopping attacking it, which isn't much of a swap, really. I mean, it's sort of saying, if you stop hitting me, I'll give you what you want. Which I think is obviously a little bit difficult for the Ukrainian people to swallow, particularly if there's no real guarantee that the hitting is actually going to stop for the long term.
Well, let's talk about those guarantees briefly while I've got you, Justin, because it doesn't seem clear at all what America is offering in the way of security guarantees. What could possibly be on the table here?
And it's really been a mess throughout. You're right to say. I mean, I don't think the US has a clear picture. what they have said they won't do is allow Ukraine into NATO, and we know that would probably be a red line for the Russians anyway, because that's technically one of the reasons they've justified the conflict they've waged, though not entirely with merit. So we know that wouldn't be allowed. Russia previously has proposed security guarantees. We think they've reiterated this again to the White House, which includes a bunch of nations guaranteeing security for Ukraine, which sounds great so far, but one of them is Russia. And all nations under the Russian proposal must agree to an armed intervention to protect Ukraine, which means Russia could veto it. They've also suggested that China join that group, and China could, of course, veto it. So there's lots of subtleties in what a security guarantee would look like that results in no safety for Ukraine, and they've been in this situation since the 1990s as regards Russia. So, there's a lot of cynicism about any promises the Russians may make, particularly if there are ways of reasoning out of them. And the European fear is, of course, Russia will use time, use its improved position in Ukraine to come back again against NATO in the next 3 or 4 years.
Justin Crump of the military intelligence firm Similine, thank you very much indeed. Great to speak to you.
Let's start this morning in Washington, looking ahead to what could be an extraordinary meeting in the White House. 7 European leaders plus Zelensky, all there lining up next to Donald Trump. Earlier, I spoke to Politico's White House and Washington reporter Daniel Littman and asked him whether they're all actually going to make it into the Oval Office.
Yeah, they're all going to be meeting with President Trump and Zelensky at the same time. It would defeat the purpose otherwise. The question is, are they going to do a press conference afterwards? How are they going to handle the press? And J.D. Vance, the vice president, is going to be at the meeting. And so if they have a pool spray where they talk to the press in the Oval Office, you don't want to have President Trump feel outnumbered if it's all these pro-Ukrainian leaders, and then you have Donald Trump, who is more of the middle ground.
Yeah, it'd be interesting in that one might think that he'll quite enjoy hosting all these people, them all coming to the White House to speak to him. But is there an element that Trump might be not intimidated per se, but slightly cowed by having all these people around him?
I think that these leaders have learned their lesson over years of observing Donald Trump, and the first 6 months of this administration, seeing what works and what doesn't, and kind of telling Trump that he can be a great peacemaker, that he has worked very hard so far to lead to peace in Ukraine, not to offend him in any way, but to tell him that Vladimir Putin is not of that same ilk in terms of how he doesn't seem to want to do the hard work of actually making peace in Ukraine. And so they're going to play to Trump's vanity, and they're going to be very thankful and grateful there, because they're not going to open themselves up to any question of how Zelensky acted in the first Oval Office meeting, where he was chastised for not being grateful enough to Trump and the U.S.
Yeah, presumably this is a case of safety in numbers and part of protecting Zelensky. Do you think that having all these leaders in the Oval Office would stop Donald Trump and J.D. Vance going after Zelensky, I suppose, in the way that some people feel they did back in February?
I think that he is not going to be attacking Zelensky because he realizes his legacy is on the line, that he can't just expose Zelensky to Putin and the Russian attacks. And I think we're going to hear from Zelensky potentially that since Trump came into office, the drone attacks have doubled from Russia, that even though the war may not have started because of if Trump was in office, as Putin says, that regardless, it is getting worse, even when Trump is in office. So I think we're going to hear more flattery, and we're going to try to see if there's a step in the right direction of bringing Zelensky, Trump, and Putin to a trilateral meeting in the next week. Trump said as early as Friday this could be happening, or is peace a distant prospect and a three-way meeting is pie in the sky?
Just describe to us, Daniel, over the weekend, it feels like Donald Trump's position has shifted from before Friday, he was talking about getting to a ceasefire as quickly as possible. Now it seems that he is more agreeing with what Vladimir Putin might have suggested in Alaska on Friday, which is that you want a full peace deal rather than a ceasefire before that deal.
Yeah, I think that you're describing things accurately, because what Trump says is that if you have such a ceasefire without a broader deal pretty quickly, you could just recreate this war, and that this could just be a very temporary ceasefire and doesn't actually lead to anything. So I wouldn't say that Trump is knowingly trying to agree with Putin here. I think that Trump honestly thinks that if they can just finish the peace negotiations, or even get to a very final stage of that, then might as well just do that, and instead of waiting for a ceasefire that may never come in a long time. So I think that's all to say that I would not view Trump's position as a total endorsement of Putin's point of view. I think he does want to figure this out, and I think the security guarantees and basically the U.S. agreeing to do Article 5 protections for Ukraine, that's significant, and so we'll see if that actually helps Ukraine want to make a deal.
Yeah, and on that point, Daniel, Steve Witkoff has suggested to CNN, like you say, that the US and European countries could offer, in his words, effectively an Article 5-like security guarantee, bypassing NATO, but still Article 5-like, which sounds much stronger than anything the US would have previously agreed to. Is that something the US is likely to do, considering in Europe it's felt like the US wouldn't want to back Article 5 for those countries that are in NATO?
Yeah, quite ironic that you could have effective Article 5 for Ukraine, but you can feel like Trump and the U.S. are not as strong for NATO countries itself. And so I think that is this is something that we were always going to see as part of the deal. And so we're kind of seeing the contours of how this would operate with Western troops and security forces in Kyiv, likely, or other parts of Ukraine, after this war comes to an end, as kind of muscle to try to dissuade Russia from invading. That's not to say that they couldn't easily just invade in a few years, and then those troops would probably just be leaving the country. So it's a little bit of a kind of intimidation tactic to prevent Russia from rearming and striking again. And then there would be something in, I think what's also being talked about is something in the Russian constitution of saying, oh, they won't attack, promise not to go after the rest of Ukraine. And so I think what Trump is saying is, if Ukraine's position keeps getting materially worse as it has been in the last 6 months or so, just little by little, then Ukraine should make a deal now, because in 6 months they might have lost more territory. So might as well just make a deal, strike a deal now, prevent loss of life. But what Ukraine doesn't want to do is give away territory that hasn't been lost.